Senhoras e senhores, assistiremos agora à palestra O Poder Oculto do Caráter, que será proferida pelo jornalista do New York Times, Paul Tough. Paul é especialista em educação e autor do best-seller na área educacional How Children Succeed, no qual explora o lado afetivo dos programas educacionais bem-sucedidos. Senhoras e senhores, convidamos ao palco Paul Tough.
Hello. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you to everyone at Positivo and at SalaMundo for inviting me here and making me feel so welcome in Brazil. This is my first time in Brazil, so it's a real honor for me to be here. My book, How Children Succeed, was published in the United States last September, almost a year ago. And ever since, I've been speaking about it, doing speeches and interviews in Canada and the United States. But this is my first time speaking about it outside of North America. So it's a particular honor for me to be here. I'm also very pleased that the book is being translated now into Portuguese and will be published in Brazil early next year by Intrinseca. And it's exciting to me to be able to talk about these ideas in a different national context. Most of the reporting that I did for this book took place in the United States, but I think that the ideas in the book transcend national borders. As a reading experience, How Children Succeed is a collection of stories about people, but at its heart, it is a book about an idea. And the idea at the center of the book is that the conventional wisdom that has governed our thinking for the last couple of decades at least about child development and education has been misguided. We've been emphasizing the wrong skills and abilities in our children, and we've been using the wrong strategies to help develop those skills and abilities. The name that I give in the book to this conventional wisdom is the cognitive hypothesis. And what I mean by that is this idea that I think a lot of us share, even if we don't often speak it out loud, that the one quality that matters most in a child's success is his or her IQ. That it's all about that narrow range of cognitive skills that get measured on standardized tests. I think this is behind our obsession with test scores, even when we tell ourselves that they don't define us or don't define our children. I think we've invested them with a whole lot of importance. And I think we do this because we really believe on some deep level that those tests measure what matters. But the scientists and the educators who I wrote about in How Children Succeed have identified a very different set of skills that they say matter at least as much as IQ, and possibly more so. The list includes things like grit, curiosity, conscientiousness, optimism, self-control. If you talk to an economist, they will tell you that this is a list of non-cognitive skills. Psychologists sometimes call them personality traits. Neuroscientists like the term executive functions. And educators, and I think a lot of the rest of us, think of these as character strengths. So a few years ago when I started my reporting, I followed two paths at the same time. I spent a lot of time reporting on people who were working directly with children, trying to help them succeed. So that meant a lot of educators, but also pediatricians and mentors. And then I spent a lot of time reading research in all of these fields, in neuroscience, in economics, in developmental psychology, trying to understand just what we knew about how children succeed. Something else happened just as I was starting my reporting that changed my perspective on these questions, which is that my wife and I had our first child. Our son, Ellington, is now 4. And so I had the strange experience, especially in the first year of his life that I would often be spending my mornings locked in my office at home, reading these dense neuroscience papers about the importance of early brain development. And then I'd spend my afternoons rolling around on the living room carpet with my son and his stuffed animals, trying not to let myself get too self-conscious about how what I was reading in the morning connected with what I was doing with him in the afternoon. But it was hard not to think of him as my little experimental subject. And the research that had the biggest impact on me as a parent, especially during those early years, all had to do with the biology of stress. And the person who guided me through this research more than anyone else was a pediatrician in San Francisco named Nadine Burke Harris. I found myself really drawn as a writer to Nadine's personal story. She grew up in relative wealth. She was the daughter of Jamaican immigrants, and she grew up in Silicon Valley near San Francisco. She went off to medical school and then to the Harvard Graduate School of Public Health. And then she came back to San Francisco, and as a fairly young woman, she did this pretty daring thing, which is that she opened her own pediatric clinic, the first one of its kind in the poorest neighborhood in San Francisco. And at first, Nadine, like a lot of young, ambitious people, thought she had all the answers to every question. And in lots of ways, she did. She was doing exactly what you're supposed to do as an inner-city pediatrician. She was improving the immunization rate for her patients. She was giving them the medicines they needed when they got sick. But she was increasingly haunted by this sense that what was really making her patients sick were things that she couldn't possibly immunize them against. It was the stress and the trauma, the noise and the violence and the chaos that surrounded them every day. The way she put it to me was that she often felt more like a battlefield surgeon than like a primary care physician, just patching these kids up and sending them back into a war zone. And the frustration that she felt made her want to understand better what was really going on in the lives of her young patients. So she started to do this research. She found this one study that changed her perspective. It really changed her whole life on the long-term effect of childhood trauma. This study found that if you take a group of adults, the ones who have experienced significant amounts of trauma as children, they have heart disease rates that are twice as high as normal, cancer rates that are twice as high, emphysema rates that are 4 times as high as normal, suicide rates that are 12 times as high. And what we now understand is that the mechanism behind that phenomenon is stress. There are a lot of important systems being developed in the brains and bodies of young children. But one of the most important, and until recently one of the least well understood, is our stress response system. Every infant experiences stress. A baby gets sad or scared or lonely, and she cries and wails. And then usually someone picks her up and comforts her, and she calms down. And for most babies, this is actually a positive experience. The stress response system is in many ways like a muscle, and it needs that kind of regular exercise in order to develop. The problem comes when children are experiencing stress that is not mild and occasional, but that is intense and chronic, what doctors call toxic stress. And toxic stress doesn't help develop our stress response system. Instead, it debilitates it. It damages it. And that damage gets right under our skin, and it can last a lifetime. We can see its effects on our physical health, on our mental health, and on the development of the attention and concentration skills that matter so much in school. So there's a lot about this research on stress that can be depressing and daunting, but there is some good news in it as well. And that is that there is a kind of secret weapon against toxic stress. And that secret weapon is parents. when infants are able to form a close, connected bond with a parent or another caregiver, what psychologists call a secure attachment. That acts as a kind of insulation against even the worst forms of toxic stress. And one of the ways we know this is through a series of experiments that were done about 12 years ago in Montreal with rats. And one of my great fears is that my son is going to grow up and read my book and realize that most of the time when I was playing with him, I was thinking about rats. But it's true, and it's all because of these experiments done by a neuroscientist at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, named Michael Meany. And Meany was like a lot of neuroscientists. He had a whole lab full of rats, each rat living in an individual plexiglass cage. So each cage would have a mother rat and a few of her babies, known as pups. And at a certain point, Meany and his researchers noticed that there was this one particular behavior that certain mother rats did and others did not do. And he called it licking and grooming. They referred to it by its initials as LG. And licking and grooming is not about making your pups look more presentable. It's about soothing them, calming them down when they get stressed out. And if you're a lab rat pup, the thing that stresses you out more than anything else is graduate students. It's those lab assistants who will show up once a day or so and weigh you or measure you, take you out of your cage. And when the lab assistants would put the pups back into their cage, they would be shaking, trembling, nervous, and some mother rats would do this soothing ritual called licking and grooming, and some would not. And so Meany wanted to try to figure out what the long-term effect of licking and grooming might be. So he devised this experiment. He divided the mother rats up into two categories. The ones who did a whole lot of licking and grooming, he called the high LG mother rats. The ones who didn't do much licking and grooming were the low LG mother rats. Each mother rat raised her pup just for the first 2 weeks of life, either doing a lot of licking and grooming or not doing a lot of licking and grooming. And then the scientists separated the pups from their mothers. The pups grew to adulthood, which for a rat is about 3 months. And then the scientists gave these new adult rats a whole series of tests. And the rats who had received significant amounts of licking and grooming as pups did better on all kinds of tests. They were braver. They were more curious. They did better at mazes. They were healthier. They lived longer. When the scientists looked at their brains under a microscope, they could see differences in the size and shape of certain parts of their brain, all because of this one small behavior that their mothers had done just in the first week or so of life. So I spent a lot of time during my son's first year trying to figure out what it might mean to be a high LG human parent. I want to assure you I did not lick my son at any point. And if you look at photos of him from his first year, you'll notice that my wife and I weren't very good at grooming him either. But I think there is a human equivalent to licking and grooming. And it's the kind of holding and soothing, talking and singing that to so many parents comes so naturally. The subtitle of my book talks about the hidden power of character. I think there are a lot of people, when they hear about this research about rats, they wonder, well, what does this possibly have to do with character? But one of the things that I tried to do in How Children Succeed is find connections between different research disciplines that often don't get connected. And I think one of the most important discoveries that this new generation of neuroscientists has made is the connections that they've been able to draw between infant brain chemistry and adult psychology. What they're really telling us is that underneath this complex collection of qualities that we think of as our character, you can often find the interactions of specific chemicals in the first years of life in the brains of infants. And what the research suggests is that if we want to intervene in this non-cognitive or character dimension, there are two particular times in a child's life that are especially fruitful. One is in early childhood, when the brain, as we know, is especially malleable, especially plastic. But the other is in adolescence. And that's because of a phenomenon that psychologists call metacognition. And metacognition just means thinking about thinking. And it is in adolescence when, for the first time, young people are able to reflect on their own thought processes, to really think deeply about themselves. And if you've spent much time with teenagers, you might have noticed they like thinking deeply about themselves a lot. And so what these interventions do is try to take advantage of that tendency to get these young people to change their habits, change their patterns, and really change their character. And one place where I saw this in action in my reporting was in 2 schools in New York City that are trying this new experimental collaboration around character education. One school is the KIPP Infinity Middle School, a charter school in a poor neighborhood in Harlem that serves mostly low-income students. The other school is the Riverdale Country School, one of the most exclusive and expensive private schools in New York City. So these are 2 very different schools, serving very different student populations. And yet, a few years ago, the 2 educators who ran these 2 schools found themselves in a similar situation. On paper, both of their schools were doing just great. The KIPP students were all getting fantastic scores on the New York State standardized tests. The Riverdale kids were all getting into the best colleges in the United States. And yet, David Levin, the head of the KIPP schools in New York, and Dominic Randolph, the head of the Riverdale school, felt like there was something missing in the education that they were giving to their students. They felt like they were producing graduates who were great test takers, great at applying to college, but who were lacking the kind of inner strength, the grit or resilience or self-discipline that helps them deal with real challenges. And so they would often get out there into the real world, whether that meant high school or college or beyond, and they would meet with some setback, as we all eventually do, and these students would often get completely derailed. And so both Dave and Dominic felt that if they wanted to help their students succeed not just on next week's test, but in the long term and in a deep way, they had to find some way to address their character. And so they decided to collaborate. And they began working with a team of psychologists from the University of Pennsylvania who had been analyzing the building blocks of character. And working together, working with surveys and statistics, they came up with a list of 7 character strengths that they have determined are the most important, the most predictive of long-term success. Here's their list of 7. Optimism, zest, grit, curiosity, social intelligence, gratitude, and self-control. And at the KIPP schools, they've now taken this list of 7 character strengths and turned them into an actual character report card. So 4 times a year, every student at KIPP Infinity is evaluated on all 7 of these character strengths by each of his or her teachers. In order to understand the thinking behind the character report card, I think it is useful to know about the work of a psychologist at Stanford University named Carol Dweck. And Carol Dweck is especially famous for her work on mindset. She discovered a few years ago that one of the best predictors of which children will succeed and which ones will not turns out to be their opinion on this one obscure question about the malleability of intelligence. And she uses that to divide us into those who have a growth mindset and those who have a fixed mindset. So the people who believe that intelligence, that IQ is fixed in place after a certain point, and there's not much that we can do to change it. They have a fixed mindset. And those who believe that our intelligence can change, we can improve it, we can get much smarter, they have a growth mindset. The paradox of this question is that the people who have the fixed mindset are actually more correct on the facts. After about age 8, our pure IQ doesn't change much at all. But what's complicated about this problem is that the people with the growth mindset tend to do better in life, even if they're completely wrong on the facts. And that's because when young people have a growth mindset, they tend to work harder, they try more, they deal better with failure. And that's especially true with students in school. If you talk to a 7th grade student, no matter what he tells you, they all have a fixed mindset. When you're in 7th grade, you think you're going to be in 7th grade for the rest of your life. And you think that the smart kids are always going to be the smart kids. But when you can change that idea, when you can give them the notion that hard work matters, that we can improve ourselves, we can practice things and get better at them, then they tend to work harder. And they deal better with bad grades. If you get a bad grade on a test and you have a fixed mindset, it becomes a sign of your inherent lack of self-worth. If you have a growth mindset, it becomes a sign that you just didn't try hard enough, and you're more likely to try harder next time. So what the character report card does is it takes this growth mindset idea and it transfers it from intelligence to character. It tells students that even in these dimensions that seem so innate and fixed, our curiosity, our self-control, even in these qualities that we can change, we can do better, we can practice, we can improve. So I mentioned that Riverdale and KIPP worked together to come up with this list of 7 character strengths. And that at KIPP, they turned them into a character report card. But at Riverdale, the private school, they're not doing a character report card. And when I asked Dominic Randolph, the head of the school, why that was, he explained that at a school like his, which is a typical New York City private school, highly competitive, high stress, high anxiety. So I was saying that these two schools, KIPP and Riverdale, worked together to come up with a character report card with a list of 7 character strengths. And at KIPP, they turned this list into a character report card. But at Riverdale, they did not do that. They're not doing a character report card. And when I asked Dominic Randolph, the head of the school, why that was, he explained that at a school like his, which is a typical New York City private school, highly competitive, a lot of stress, that at a school like his, if he introduced something called a report card for things like curiosity and zest, there would be $200 an hour curiosity tutors wandering the halls of Riverdale trying to offer their services. And everyone would be competing to be the most zest-filled or the most curious student. And that was really the opposite of what he wanted for his students. Dominic was an interesting character to me. As I said, on paper, his school was doing just great. And yet he was deeply concerned that his students, mostly affluent, were missing out on these important opportunities to develop these character strengths because they were so protected from real challenge. Protected by their school, protected by their families, and really protected by their whole culture. And when you speak with parents of students at a school like Riverdale about the idea that their students might not be being challenged enough, they often respond with horror. And the reality is that students at these schools work very hard. They have a ton of homework, they carry around those giant backpacks. They're often completely stressed out. And yet I think the reality is that we can often confuse stress for challenge. I think that's true for ourselves, and I also think it's true for our children and our students. For me, it's like the difference between exercising by climbing a mountain and exercising by running on a treadmill. You know, when you run on a treadmill, it is exhausting. You are completely burned out by the end of it. But you sort of know when you get up there and punch in your 20 or 30 minutes that you're going to make it to the end. And yet when you climb a mountain, you might get the same workout, but there is some real challenge involved. There's some risk. You might not make it. You might actually fail. And it was failure that Dominic Randolph kept coming back to in our conversations. The way he put it was that character strengths like grit and self-control are born out of failure. And in most high-achieving academic environments these days, no one really fails anything. I wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine about what's going on at KIPP in Riverdale. And my editors gave it the headline, "What if the secret to success is failure?" It was a great headline, very provocative. And yet I think it's a bit of an oversimplification. I don't think it's true that failure itself leads to success. I did most of my reporting in high-poverty neighborhoods, a lot of them on the south side of Chicago, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the whole country. And in those neighborhoods, the problem is not that children don't have enough failure, enough adversity in their lives. In fact, they're surrounded by failure and adversity. And for the most part, it's not making them stronger and more resilient. For the most part, it is wearing them down and wearing them out. I think what we have in the United States, and I think in many other countries as well, is an adversity gap, where we have some students, especially those who are growing up in poverty, who simply have too much adversity in their lives, and they need protection from that adversity. And then we have other children, especially those growing up in affluence, who actually don't have enough adversity in their lives and could use some more. And I think that part of the equation is one that is very difficult for parents to accept. I know when I think about my own son, there's something deep in my DNA that makes me want to protect him from all adversity at any cost. But I think what I and a lot of other parents are coming to believe is that in doing that, in trying to protect our children, we're often doing more harm than good. And this idea that a certain amount of adversity might be a good thing for children recently got some support in the psychological literature by a study that was done by a team of psychologists at the State University of New York in Buffalo. And these researchers took a group of 2,000 adults and they gave them two tests. The first was an adversity questionnaire, just this checklist of different adverse events that can happen to you in childhood. And you had to check off one for every adverse event that you'd experienced. And it wasn't a list of terrible traumas. It was things like your parents got divorced, or someone in your family loses a job, or you survived a natural disaster. And then the second test was a standard psychological test of happiness and psychological health and well-being. And for the most part, the researchers found the relationship between these two tests that was exactly what they expected. The people who had experienced all kinds of adversity in childhood, who had checked off 12 or 15 boxes on that adversity questionnaire, they weren't doing well at all. The adversity they experienced in childhood had affected their mental health, and it was continuing to affect it well into adulthood. But then the researchers noticed something curious in their data, which is that there were about 200 adults in this group of 2,000 who hadn't checked off a single box on that adversity questionnaire. They hadn't experienced any real adversity at all in childhood. And so the researchers looked at the graph and they figured, oh, well, so these must be the happiest and best adjusted people in the whole country. But of course they weren't. Their happiness and mental health scores were no better than people who had experienced 8 or 10 adverse events. And the people who were doing best were the ones who had experienced 3 or 4 adverse events. It turns out that the relationship between childhood adversity and happiness is an inverse U-shaped quadratic equation, a handy thing to know as you go through life. But that still leaves the question, why? Why is some adversity a good thing for children? And I think it's because it gives us an opportunity to practice failing in childhood, to learn how to manage failure. And this idea of the importance of helping children learn how to manage failure is one that runs through many different parts of my book. I think it's what those mother rats were doing when they were licking and grooming their pups. I think it's what the best teachers do every day in the classroom. But the place in my reporting where I saw it most vividly was over a chessboard. When you go to chess tournaments in the United States, you notice that there is an achievement gap in chess, and it's similar to the achievement gap in our schools. At most tournaments, the schools that are winning the big trophies are private schools or public schools from wealthy suburbs. That used to be true, but it's actually no longer true in the middle school years, in grades 6 and 7 and 8. And in those years, that equation has been turned completely on its head, all because of one school. Intermediate School 318, a traditional, regular public school in Brooklyn, New York, that has a mostly low-income minority student population. And yet, this school, for the last 5 years, has won every big middle school chess championship in the country. They recently made it on the front page of the New York Times for winning the National High School Chess Championship, which was quite an achievement when you realize that none of their students had yet been to high school. And yet they beat some of the best high school players in the country. And so a few years ago, when I was starting my reporting, they had just started this winning streak. And I wanted to try to understand why they were doing so well. So I spent a couple of years following them around, going to tournaments and into the classroom. And I came to believe that the secret to their success all has to do with the teaching strategy, the teaching style of their chess coach, a woman named Elizabeth Spiegel. And I think what she was doing for her students more than anything else was helping them learn how to manage failure. One of the things that I didn't realize about chess until I started my reporting is that when you play chess, you fail all the time. No matter how good you are, you're still going to lose about half your games. And even when you win, you make dozens of stupid mistakes every game. And if you're a 7th grade student and you're faced with that kind of daily, repeated failure, there are 2 temptations. One is just to laugh it off and say, who cares? I didn't really try anyway. The other is to dwell in the shame of your loss. Convince yourself that you're the worst chess player ever. And what Elizabeth was able to do was to guide her students between those 2 temptations. And she did it by getting them to look honestly and straightforwardly at their own mistakes, at their own failures. There's this ritual that every student on the Intermediate School 318 chess team knows very well, which is that at a tournament, after every game, whether you win or lose, you then have to come and sit down with Elizabeth Spiegel, the chess coach, and replay the whole game with her, move by move. And I sat in on a few of these sessions with her, and they could be a little bit grueling. I somehow had this idea that she was going to say things like, oh, well, you tried your best, you had fun, that's what's important, right? But it wasn't like that at all. She could be a little bit mean. She would say things like, a rook, what were you thinking? Did you even look at the board? That's pathetic. There's this rule of thumb that I think every teacher in the United States knows, even if they're not quite sure where they first heard it. which is that you're supposed to give 5 compliments to your students for every 1 criticism. If you fall below that number, the fear is that you will damage your students' self-esteem. And it was actually Elizabeth who first told me about this rule. She said, "I'm a little worried about my ratio." And I said, "Yeah, no kidding." For her, it was more like 5 criticisms for every 1 compliment. And yet, somehow, it was working. She was able to convey to her students that she cared very deeply about them and how they were doing. She had high expectations for them. She wasn't going to hold their hand and make the moves for them on the chessboard. But she was going to give them the knowledge and the skill and the confidence that they needed to go out there and win the next game. And very often, that's exactly what they did. And I think she was not only giving them this important chess knowledge, she was also helping them learn how to manage failure. And in the process, I think she was really helping to develop their character. Now, how exactly we do this, either as parents or as teachers, is still something of a conundrum. There are no real easy answers. I've struggled with it mostly as a parent. When my son was born, I was one of those typical anxious parents trapped in the cognitive hypothesis. I thought if I didn't get those Mozart CDs right there in the maternity ward, my son would never amount to anything. And doing this reporting and reading this research helped me to calm down a little bit as a parent. I still think that those early years are crucially important for my son or anyone else. But I think what he learned that was most important were not things that you could teach with flashcards. It was about the relationship that he had with me and my wife and with the other adults in his life. I really have become convinced by a lot of the ideas of attachment psychology that, especially for the first 12 or 18 months of life, we really can't be too loving, can't be too doting to our children. It really is a good idea with infants to come every time they cry. The problem for parents is that when you have a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 25-year-old who's living in his parents' basement, it's probably not a good idea for his parents to come every time he cries. And yet there's no clear roadmap for parents on how to get from that licking and grooming style of parenting to that Elizabeth Spiegel style of parenting. Our son just turned 4, and my wife and I are now at this transition phase where we're trying to pull back a little bit, to let our son solve more problems for himself, to fall down sometimes and not get helped back up. And it's difficult for us. I think my wife and I are both more naturally lickers and groomers. But I really believe what Dominic Randolph says, that if we want him to succeed, we first need to learn how to let him fail. Now, when we're talking about kids who are growing up in deep poverty, in high poverty neighborhoods, I don't think the answer is to let them fail more. I think, if anything, we have been letting those students fail too much for too long. And with them, we need a new and different strategy. Personally, I find this research about brain chemistry and adversity and attachment to be important and interesting. But I think that there is a risk in writing about it and talking about it the way that I have done. And that is that it can make us feel complacent or even fatalistic. The neurochemistry sometimes seems so powerful that we can't imagine that any child who grows up in really deep disadvantage, in deep poverty, surrounded by toxic stress, without that secure attachment, can ever go on to real success. And yet, there are plenty of those success stories. Every educator in this room can think of some. And there are a few that I write about in my book. I think about this one young woman named Kiwana Lerma. When I met her a few years ago, she was a junior in high school, in a low-performing high school on the south side of Chicago. And Kiwana had had just about as difficult a childhood as we would ever wish on anyone. She grew up in deep poverty. She had a family that was chaotic and unstable. She was homeless for much of her childhood. And she had a mother who loved her and cared about her, but found it difficult to give her the support and the stability that she wanted to. And Kiwana reacted to this upbringing the way a lot of young people do. It made her upset and angry. And she brought that anger with her to school every day. In her 6th grade year, she was sent to the principal's office 72 times for behavioral infractions. They eventually put her in the slow class, the delayed class at her school. And this was one of those slow classes where they didn't really try to teach the kids anything. They just gave them popcorn and let them watch movies, and no one really tried to educate them. And as a result, Kiwana fell further and further behind. And yet when I met her in her junior year of high school, she was in the middle of this remarkable transformation. She'd gone from being a failing student in her first year of high school to being a straight A student, determined to go to college. And I followed her and her classmates through their senior year, their final year of high school, as she was applying to college. And it was a real struggle for her. You know, she never did well on the standardized tests that you need to get into college in the United States. Her highest score put her in the bottom 5th of all students, all high school students in the United States. And yet she did so much work in school. She worked so hard. She got such good grades that she was admitted to a good college called the University of Western Illinois. And when she showed up on campus, she was behind every other student in her class. But she worked harder than anyone else on that whole university campus. And as a result, when she finished her first year, her freshman year of college, she had a 3.8 GPA. She was a straight A student. She now just finished her 2nd year, and she's determined to finish her college degree in 4 years. When you do the kind of writing that I do, or when you read books like mine, you encounter stories like Kiwana's from time to time, and I think they can be inspiring or moving. But to be honest, I think they can also sometimes leave us feeling a little bit empty. The success stories just feel so rare and random. What's exciting to me about this new research is that I think for the first time, we're coming to understand the science behind how Kiwana became Kiwana. Both how the environment in which she grew up got her so completely off track, and how the support and the intervention that she received got her so firmly back on track. I've now met a lot of students who have grown up in deep disadvantage and gone on to real success. And I find they all share 2 things. One is character. They all have deep reserves of grit and perseverance, resilience, optimism, hope. But the other thing they all share is help. There was someone somewhere along the way who reached out to them and gave them a helping hand just when they needed it the most. And so my hope is that this research doesn't make us complacent or fatalistic. My hope is that it makes us want to help even more. And I think there are lots of ways that those of us in this room can help. I think it's clear for educators that what we can do is be that one person in the lives of more children who gives them the help they need just when they need it. But I think for the rest of us, we can help in the work we do, the organizations we support. And I think we can also help on the level of policy, in how we vote, what we say to our leaders about the kind of system that we want them to build. And right now, in the United States, and I think in most parts of the world, there is not a good system for kids who grow up in really deep disadvantage to go on to great success. But I think we could develop a very different sort of system. It would be more comprehensive. It would start earlier. It would work more directly with families. It would go well beyond schools. But in the classroom, I think teachers would be encouraged not just to teach those important intellectual skills, but also to help students figure out how to bounce back from a disappointment, how to deal better with a confrontation, how to persist at a difficult task. And I think if we can get that right in the United States, in Brazil, and beyond, then we can have a world where success stories are no longer so rare and random, but where they're happening all the time, all around us. Thank you very much. Thank you.